Hey everybody, Brady, aka the War Hamster, here for another episode of the Re-Federalist Report, where we talk about different issues that we need to solve to get back to a federal republic. Doing so, we have been going through James Madison's notes from the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. The reason we're doing that is there is no better way to figure out what original intent was than from listening to the words of the people who were actually there at the convention. What did they debate? What did they fear? How did they come to conclusions they came to? And joining me in this journey is my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Glad to be here as always, and thanks everybody for participating. This is a very important ride.
We last left off. Well, this is going to be our 28th episode of Madison's Notes, and we are not halfway done yet, although I am going to try to move up the pace a little bit going forward. But
I knew we were getting close to 30.
Yeah, we're getting there.
That's what are we, 5 weeks into the convention for a 4.5 month?
To show what that looks like. So we were on June 30th, I believe.
So we're about 5 weeks in.
All right, when we left off, Oliver Ellsworth was speaking, talking about large state versus small states, how to divide power to keep balance. He's talking about confederacies. And Ellsworth is very much of a nationalist, and he would get worse as time went on after the convention. Very much a Hamiltonian. But we did a little bit of a bio on him. And this is the man who authored the Judiciary Act of 1789, which I consider to be the first blow struck in a war against Confederacy, or federalism, I should say. So Mr. Ellsworth stood up, and Mr. Madison, talking in the third person, is next, and he's going to have a very, very long bit of...
real quick thing about Ellsworth, too. I can't remember if we mentioned this last week, but one of your favorite pieces of legislation, the Judiciary Act of 1789. He was, one of Connecticut's first U.S. senators, and he was the primary author of that legislation.
Yes. We discussed that, and I'm not happy about it. So I do not hold Ellsworth in very high regard for that.
Yeah. I just wanted to lay that out there for the audience so that you understand. I mean, this guy, and he's the Chief Justice right before John Marshall. So gives you an idea of who and what this guy is. But anyway, Mr. Madison, though, James Madison, and getting back to him, and I've said this before, but I want to say it again. Madison began very closely in his mindset to Alexander Hamilton. He was quite the nationalist going in. Remember, the Virginia plan, the big government plan, the big state protection plan was his. He authored it. But by the end of the convention, he's a lot more Jeffersonian. And by his presidency, he's very Jeffersonian. We're throughout this exercise, we're going to see his metamorphosis slowly, bit by bit. So don't be surprised when sometimes he sounds a little bit nationalist, and then he starts saying things that aren't quite so much. And I have a feeling we're going to see some of that here. So go ahead.
Yeah, this is prior to his big transformation. And I'll go out and say that Doug is more forgiving of an individual than I am. I don't hold Madison in as high as regard as Doug does, but I do hold him in somewhat high regard. It's just not quite as high. Probably because he's only 5'1". Imagine Madison talking to 6'2" Washington. It would be kind of a funny scene to see.
Yeah. Jefferson, Washington, and Madison in the same room together. That had to have been interesting. Because Jefferson was fairly tall, not as tall as Washington, but he was fairly tall as well.
Well, the other thing about Washington is he was pretty broad. He got pretty broad shoulders as well. He was a big man.
Yeah, or as I like to tell people, he was a man's man, and when he walked in a room, he commanded the room.
Yeah, that charisma is a lot of the reason he was our first president.
Yeah.
It was important to have a symbol like that of strength. So Mr. Madison did justice to the able and close reasoning of Mr. E., which is Ellsworth, but must observe that it did not always accord with itself. On another occasion, the large states were described by him as the aristocratic states, ready to oppress the small. Now, this is Madison from Virginia, which is the most populous state with about 800,000 citizens at the time. Now the small are the House of Lords requiring a negative to defend them against the more numerous commons. Mr. Ellsworth had also erred in saying that no instance had existed in which confederated states had not retained to themselves a perfect equality of suffrage. Passing over the German system, of which the King of Prussia has 9 voices, he reminded Mr. E of the Lycian Confederacy, in which the component members had votes proportioned to their importance, and which Montesquieu recommends as the fittest model for that form of government.
And stop here for a second. Montesquieu is in such high regard. Remember, it's a French writer, and the French didn't like Montesquieu, but the colonialists, the young Americans did, and they studied. When I say they, I mean the founding fathers. They studied different republics, different systems, and they understood that no system was perfect. And historically, they could not take exactly any system as it was, for not only because a lot of them had their flaws, but also this Union of States was something very different. But they were drawing the best they could from them. And the Lycian Confederacy was a shining example, as Montesquieu put it, of a good system. But because it was a confederacy, it did have its flaws. But compared to much of what they had looked at, and they looked at there was the Republic. I'm blanking now. Down in the Romanian area, and then of course they looked at Rome and they looked at Greece. The democracies out of Greece. They referred to Montesquieu's writings. They referred to John Locke's writings. But the Lycian Republic was, or should I say Confederacy, was one of the important influences. And you have to also remember the Saxons and the Lycians have a common thread there.
I'm surprised they don't talk more, or they haven't referred more to the Dutch Republic, because there are a lot of similarities to what we ended up getting and what the Dutch had 200 years prior, or only 100 years prior.
This is true. And the Dutch, as we've talked about on other shows, was very, very much so involved in the early colonialization of the New World, but they were more on the economic end, and they did quite well with that.
And my favorite little factoid that nobody is taught in American history is, had it not been for the Dutch, the Revolutionary War would not have been won. They were smuggling arms, money, any kind of supplies from their Caribbean strongholds, the few that they had left by the 1780s or 1770s. But the Dutch had a big impact on the American Revolution.
Yeah, and the Dutch not only wanted the trading partner, but they were not exactly buddies with Britain or any of the British allies. Then again, they didn't always get along with France either, but that's a different story. Go ahead.
Well, that was right smack dab in the middle of the war over the. Basically, England's replacing the Dutch Republic. The pound is replacing the guilder as the international reserve currency. We're right in the heart of that transition being completed. And, the whole expression I always say, what's the difference between a pirate and a privateer? It's a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. The British captains and the Dutch captains, they were raiding each other left and right with their letters of marquee.
And then Black Bart would later take everything. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Had the fact been as stated by Mr. Ellsworth, it would have been of little avail to him, or rather would have strengthened the arguments against him. The history and fate of the several confederacies, modern as well as ancient, demonstrating some radical vice in their structure. In reply to the appeal of Mr. Ellsworth to the faith plighted in the existing federal compact, he remarked that the party claiming from others an adherence to a common engagement ought to at least be guiltless itself of a violation. Madison is really hard to read here, especially because he's writing about what he's writing in third person, but he's very long-winded.
Yeah, and you got to remember, once again, he is right now stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's not really sure which way to go yet. But he knows that what Ellsworth is saying is not exactly right. He knows that.
Of all the states, however, Connecticut was perhaps least able to urge this plea. Besides the various omissions to perform the stipulated acts from which no state was free, the legislature of that state had, by a pretty recent vote, positively refused to pass a law for complying with the requisitions of Congress, and had transmitted a copy of the vote to Congress. Meaning, Connecticut, you don't really have any place to speak because you've been a bit rebellious.
And he's kind of stabbing at Ellsworth here.
It was urged, he said, continually that an equality of votes in the second branch was not only necessary to secure the small, but would be perfectly safe to the large ones, whose majority in the first branch was an effectual bulwark.
Now, understand something here, folks. This is an argument saying we have to have a bicameral Congress. And the second branch needs to be different from the first branch, the first chamber, should we say, of Congress, between the House and the Senate. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation with a one chamber that pretty much controlled everything. And it just brings to mind in recent arguments by the Democratic Socialists of America to get rid of the Senate and get rid of the president, make him go back, be a part of that one chamber Congress. And as I've mentioned on shows before, we did that and it was failing. And this is the reason for this discussion here. It was failing. The one house was failing, and the president not being a separate executive was failing.
But notwithstanding this apparent defense, the majority of states might still injure the majority of people. 1, they could construct the wishes and interests of the majority. 2, they could extort measures repugnant to the wishes and interests of the majority. 3, they could impose measures adverse thereto, as the second branch will probably exercise some great powers in which the first will not participate.
Now, what he's saying here is something that's often attributed to Jefferson. What we fear here is a tyranny of the majority. And as I've mentioned many times, Madison in Federalist 10 explains that when you have factions, the majority factions are dangerous because there's no check against them. So how do you create a check? You've got to give the minority factions a larger voice so that they can be set against each other. And that's what he's starting to argue here is we have to be careful here because the majority, the tyranny of the majority, could be a problem if we allow it to run free.
Meaning the second branch, the U.S. Senate, will have some powers above and beyond that of the first branch, and that's basically the bulwark against that tyranny.
Yeah, because remember, the first branch, they're talking to be democratically elected. And I mean, I've got a list, longer than my arm of quotes against democracy by these guys. They understood the dangers of democracy. Europe understood the dangers of democracy. Their problem was that they felt that the way to resolve it was to go the opposite extreme with monarchy. So this is really an argument against democracy and an argument for a bicameral Congress so that the two houses can check each other.
He admitted that every peculiar interest, whether in any class of citizens or any description of states, ought to be secured as far as possible. Wherever there is danger of attack, there ought to be given a constitutional power of defense.
Check and balance is what he's saying there.
But he contended that the states were divided into different interests, not only by their difference of size, but by other circumstances, the most material of which resulted partly from climate, but principally from the effects of their having or not having slaves. Interesting.
The slavery question was a dominant discussion during the Declaration of Independence and during the Constitutional Convention. And you got to realize at this point, all of the states are still slave states. All of them, slavery is still legal. Only Pennsylvania has begun and I should say the region of Vermont has begun legislation that was anti-slavery. that would begin the process of abolishing slavery at a gradual pace. But but the writing was on the wall. The states in the North were beginning to all build larger abolition movements. The writing was on the wall also that eventually slavery would end in the South, or at least that's what they believed. But slavery was a primary concern. And remember, this goes back to the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence originally had 168 words of anti-slavery language in it, and 2 states, South Carolina and Georgia, the 2 most southern, they made sure that language wasn't in there by refusing to be a part of the Union. And well, the reality is they're a military buffer against Spain down there at the bottom. They were for the rest of the states, and so it was imperative that they were part of the Union, and they know this. South Carolina and Georgia know that they are imperative a part of this Union, and they are swinging bats around saying, hey, we're going to get our way otherwise. And so he's recognizing this.
I also like what he said about the differences of climate. And that goes back to one of the things we've talked about, the agrarian South versus the mercantilist North. And a lot of that does have to do with climate. All right, continuing. These 2 causes concurred in forming the great division of interest in the United States. It did not lie between the large and small states. It lay between the northern and southern. And if any defensive power were necessary, it ought to be mutually given to these 2 interests. This is such an important statement here, foreshadowing the North-South conflict coming later on. But how do you give mutual defense to the 2 sides so one does not dominate the other?
And I like the way he's saying this. He's saying, hey, guys, you're all focusing on big versus small. We've got a bigger divide.
He was so strongly impressed with this important truth that he had been casting about in his mind for some expedient that would answer its purpose.
In other words, he's saying, man, I just came up with this, and holy cow, it's bigger than even I thought.
The one which had occurred was that instead of proportioning the votes of the senates in both branches to their respective numbers of inhabitants, computing the slaves in the ratio of 5 to 3.
3/5 clause. Yeah, this is now we've seen evidence of its mentioning already a few times, but this is probably the most prominent so far.
They should be represented in one branch according to the number of free inhabitants only, and the other according to the whole number, counting the slaves as if free. Now that's interesting. By this arrangement, the southern scale would have the advantage in one house and the northern in the other. He had been restrained from proposing this expedient by 2 considerations. One was his unwillingness to urge any diversity of interests on an occasion where it was but too apt to arise of itself the other was the inequality of powers that must be vested in the 2 branches and which would destroy the equilibrium of interests.
One of the things when I was teaching my Constitution classes that I hammered over and over and over with my students was the purpose of the 2 branches was that they were different from each other. They were not identical. Today, they are nearly identical, both democratically voted in. You look back in history, the founders are looking back in history, and the most successful republics had 2 chambers, and they were different from each other. House of Commons, House of Lords. In the Roman Empire and Roman Republic, actually, should I say, before the Empire, you had the Assembly, which was the commoners, and then you had the Senate, which were the wealthy and powerful. You had 2 different voices that were set against each other. And then again, I mentioned earlier in Federalist 10, you whenever you have different factions, you set them against each other. You don't allow one to dominate the other. And he's recognizing here a few things. You got big state versus small state, you got agrarian versus industrial, and you have North versus South. And if you allow democracy for one, and then you got to come up with some other idea for the other, so that the other faction or set of factions have a voice. You do not allow one faction to control everything. You know, we live in an age today where everybody's talking about democracy. Oh, we got to save our democracy. Democracy is the tyranny of the cities, the large population areas. And this is the tyranny of the majority. And this was the thing that they were trying to guard against. This is what he's talking about here. And I think it's important to note.
Yeah, and history will show us that when the United States started expanding westward, it was really important to maintain that balance between the North and the South. I mean, this is really the spark for what would end up turning into the quote-unquote Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
But that balance was always recognized as important.
And even to this day, there's a balance because, in the northern United States, at least east of the states where the federal government owns most of the land anyway, you have a more industrial minded and even though the South now today is more industrial than they used to be, they have more manufacturing than they used to be, it's a whole different mindset. It still has kind of an agrarian mindset, the way they look at things. What's interesting is that the South voted for one particular party until they started to manufacture more. And once they started manufacturing, they suddenly switched. So if anybody wants to talk about the Great Switch, it wasn't over race, it was over economics. And it wasn't until the 90s. But anyway, I digress. Go ahead.
It was over power. Mr. Ellsworth assured the House that whatever might be thought of the representatives of Connecticut, the state was entirely federal in her disposition. He's defending himself. He appealed to her great exertions during the war in supplying both men and money. The muster rolls would show she had more troops in the field than Virginia. If she had been delinquent, it had been from inability and not more so than other states.
It's like it's like verbal cannon volleys, doesn't it?
How dare you insult my Connecticut?
Shot across the bow.
All right, Sherman is up next, and Sherman is, of course, from Georgia, right?
He's our other Connecticut guy, Roger Sherman. Now, here's the thing about Sherman. He's difficult to gauge. He's not necessarily Jeffersonian nor Hamiltonian. Ellsworth is definitely Hamiltonian in his thinking. Sherman, though, what I've always liked about Sherman, he kind of reminds me of some particular people in politics today. He's always willing to make a deal. He's always looking to make the best deal. He knows how to talk to both sides and figure out a way to get them to come together. And he also has a loud, boisterous personality. He's the kind of guy where he makes sure everybody hears him. But the fact is, he speaks from usually a true angle. Now, whether or not he's right or wrong is not the point, but he believes he is right.
What he says, and what he's going to say here is very interesting. Mr. Madison had animadverted on the delinquency of the states not fulfilling their obligations, when his object required him to prove that the Constitution of Congress was faulty. Congress is not to blame for the faults of the states. Their measures have been right, and the only thing wanting has been a further power in Congress to render them effectual. He's making the argument for more muscle in the federal government to force the states to comply with the will of Congress.
Now, understand something. You've got in this convention, in the beginning, you had one school of thought that the Congress, that the federal government should be super strong to force this union into compliance. As we proceed, you start seeing a limited government sentiment begin to bubble from certain members. And the reality is, they did need a stronger Congress. They did need a stronger government than what they had before. The question is, where is that balance? How far do you go before you cross the line? This is what they're searching for. So I understand Sherman's sentiment here. We do need a stronger Congress. We want the Congress to be stronger. But should Congress be so strong that is dictating to the states? And so he's right on the edge of this line here that I don't think they want to cross, not because they don't want to cross it, but because they know the states would never sign up for it.
Okay, next up we have Mr. Davey, and this is William Davey from North Carolina.
Okay. Yeah, and I know nothing about Mr. Davy. And people always go, well, Doug, what about such and such? I don't know everything about all of the signers, and Davy is one I have to admit I have done no research on. So I'm curious.
Well, I didn't get a chance to profile him previously, but maybe we'll do that next week if he's interested.
Okay.
I'll get a little bit more.
Well, North Carolina, I will say this: North Carolina was the second to last state to ratify the Constitution. North Carolina, I don't know about Mr. Davy, but the people and the delegates at their convention was very wary of it and filled with a lot of anti-federalists and were demanding a Bill of Rights. And so once it was going out to the states. So I'm curious if Mr. Davy resembles that sentiment.
Well, there's a reason we haven't heard too much about him, but he was much embarrassed and wished for explanations. The report of the committee allowing the legislatures to choose the Senate and establishing a proportional representation in it seemed to be impracticable. There will, according to this rule, be 90 members in the outset, and the number will increase as the new states are added. It was impossible that so numerous a body could possess the activity and other qualities required of it. Were he to vote on the comparative merits of the report as it stood and the amendment, he should be constrained to prefer the latter. The appointment of the Senate by electors chosen by the people for that purpose was, he conceived, liable to an insuperable difficulty. The larger counties or districts thrown into a general district would certainly prevail over the smaller counties or districts, and merit in the latter would be excluded altogether. Once again, we go back to the protect the big from the small, small from the big.
Well, I remember in the South, even though, when you think of North Carolina, it's a fairly good sized state. Remember in the South, the free population was much, much less than what you saw in the industrial North. They were agrarian states. And eventually in a couple of those states, the slave population would even rival that of the free population.
The report therefore seemed to be right in referring the appointment to the legislatures, whose agency in the general system did not appear to him objectionable as it did to some others. The fact was that the local prejudices and interests, which could not be denied to exist, will find their way into the national councils, whether the representatives should be chosen by the legislatures or by the people themselves. On the other hand, if a proportional representation was attended with insuperable difficulties, the making the Senate the representative of the states looked like bringing us back to Congress again and shutting out all the advantages expected from it. Under this view of the subject, he could not vote for any plan for the Senate yet proposed. He thought that in general there were extremes on both sides. We were partly federal, partly national in our union, and he did not see why the government might not, in some respects, operate on the states and others on the people. He seems to be taking both sides of this argument. But what I don't like is, he's saying, well, there can be a blend between a national government and a federal system. We've seen with history that's just not the case.
So I did a little looking up of Mr. Davy just for a real quick rundown. And his last name is misspelled there. It's Davie, William Richardson Davy, a political ally of Alexander Hamilton and leading figure in the Federalist Party. While he operated in different spheres, Hamilton nationally and Davy primarily in North Carolina, they shared identical political philosophies and goals. And both men in the Constitution fought fiercely for a strong central government. And he was integral with the ratification of the Constitution in the North Carolina Convention. He's also the father of the University of North Carolina. So the Tar Heels are all his fault. And he did, by the way, also serve as governor of the state, the 10th governor. All right, continue.
Next to speak again is James Wilson. Admitted the question concerning the number of senators to be embarrassing. If the smallest states be allowed one and the others in proportion, the Senate will certainly be too numerous. He looked forward to the time when the smallest states will contain 100,000 souls at least. Let there be one senator for each for every 100,000 souls, and let the states not having that number of inhabitants be allowed one. He was willing himself to submit to this temporary concession to the small states and threw out the idea as a ground of compromise.
It really wasn't a compromise at all.
Now, saying, it's going to be population based, but up until you youngsters get up to 100,000, we'll let you at least get a voice, even though we'll have 10 voices to your one. I should have had the map up there to show the population of the various states. I'll have that ready for next week.
Now, it's interesting that Madison puts doctor in front of Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was very proud of his 2 doctorates, but they were not official. They were given to him as, honorary. He had 2 honorary doctorates from 2 universities. He didn't have the education, but he was very proud of being Dr. Franklin, and apparently James Madison was willing to give him that concession. Now, that said, despite the fact that he didn't have all that education, Franklin did, just not.
Hang on. He had the education. He just didn't have the formal education.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was getting ready to say. He was what's the word now? Didactic.
Didactic, yeah, self-taught.
Self-taught.
All right, so Franklin.
And brilliant, of course, but we all know this. I think we all know this.
The diversity of opinions turns on 2 points. If a proportional representation takes place, the small states contend that their liberties will be in danger. If an equality of votes is to be put in its place, the large states say their money will be in danger.
He keyed on something very important, the money.
When a broad table is to be made and the edges of planks do not fit, the artist takes a little from both and makes a good joint. In like manner here, both sides must part with some of their demands in order that they may join in some accommodating proposition. He had prepared one which he would read, and that it might lie on the table for consideration.
Real quick, one of the things I've always loved about Dr. Franklin, Ben Franklin, is that he always used metaphors in such a way that it made people understand. He was really good at his use of metaphors. Anyway, go ahead.
The first proposition was in the words following: that the legislatures of the several states shall choose and send an equal number of delegates, namely, who are to compose the second branch of the general legislature. 2, that in all cases or questions wherein the sovereignty of individual states may be affected, or whereby their authority over their own citizens may be diminished, or the authority of the general government within the several states augmented, each state shall have equal suffrage. That in the appointment of all civil officers of ye general government, in the election of whom the second branch may by the Constitution have part, each state shall have equal suffrage. This leads to, of course, Senate.
The advice and consent rule, yeah.
And 4th, that in fixing the salaries of such officers and all allowances for public services, and generally in all appropriations and dispositions of money to be drawn out of the general treasury, and in all laws for supplying that treasury, the delegates of the several states shall have suffrage in proportion to the sums which their respective states do actually contribute to the treasury.
Remember, early taxation was by the states, not on the individuals. And this is what he's talking about. If you go back to Article 1, Section 9, and Article 1, Section 8, there was no direct tax. So the tax was laid on the states based on their population. And the other thing I want you to notice about Dr. Franklin, my friends, is when he spoke, not only was everybody listening, but a lot of it wound up getting implemented. He said, "Okay, here's your wrinkles. Let's iron it out. This is what I think," and everybody went, "Okay." In many cases.
So the idea he's introducing is not population-based representation in the House, but he also wants to add in has to do with tax revenues.
Right.
Now he got that from New Hampshire's Constitution. New Hampshire, where I'm sitting right now, when they originally drew up their state senate, they did not do it 1 or 2 per county. It was based on tax revenues. That's how they did their apportionment. This is where Franklin's getting that idea. And it was
more money, more representation.
Mm-hmm. Have some stake in the game.
Right.
Now, this, of course, did not get implemented. Where a ship had many owners, this was the rule of deciding on her expedition. He had been one of the ministers from this country to France during the joint war and would have been very glad if allowed a vote in distributing the money to carry it on.
That statement reveals something about Benjamin Franklin. He was a man well traveled. He had a lot more life experience and world experience than these youngsters. Not only because he was older, but because he was much more well traveled. He had seen very many other situations, systems. He had experienced them firsthand.
Next to speak, a good friend, Mr. Rufus King, the carpetbagger.
The Massachusetts guy that someday wound up in New York. All right, go ahead.
He observed that the simple question was whether each state should have an equal vote in the second branch, that it must be apparent to those gentlemen who liked neither this motion for this equality nor the report as it stood, that the report was as susceptible of amelioration as the motion, that a reform would be nugatory and nominal only if we should make another Congress of the proposed Senate, that if the adherence to an equality of votes was fixed and unalterable, there could not be less obstinacy on the other side, and that we were in fact cut in sunder already, and it was in vain to shut our eyes against it. It's a big state guy talking.
Right.
That he was, however, filled with astonishment that if he were convinced that every man in America was secured in all his rights, we should be ready to sacrifice this substantial good to the phantom of state sovereignty. That his feelings were more harrowed and his fears more agitated for his country than he could express. That he conceived this to be the last opportunity of providing for its liberty and happiness. That he could not here therefore but repeat his amazement that when a just government founded on fair representation of the people of America was within our reach, we should renounce that blessing from an attachment to the ideal freedom and importance of states. That should this wonderful illusion continue to prevail, his mind was prepared for every event rather than to sit down under a government founded in a vicious principle of representation, and which must be as short-lived as it would be unjust. He might prevail on himself to accede to some such expedient as had been hinted by Mr. Wilson, but he never could listen to an equality of votes as proposed in the motion.
And he's saying, hey, fighting for the sovereignty of the states and the states' rights, you're throwing away everybody else's rights. That's what he's saying. And he's not right. He's not correct in what he's saying, but he's basically saying, in the process of seeking liberty, you're throwing it away because you're letting the states have too much. We just need a strong central system just to control the whole situation and nail it down, because they will be all over the place. You can't control them. They're out of control. And, this phantom of states, and you got to remember this idea of having states that are sovereign in a union in this manner that they were attempting had never truly succeeded other than maybe the 12 tribes of Israel. And he, as a big government-minded guy, Hamiltonian-minded guy, is saying, hey, the only way to control their fickleness is to put them under an iron fist.
But it's also it's a very disingenuous argument saying that it is a fiction that there's such things as sovereign states, because it is exactly what was in existence right this moment under the Articles of Confederation. It most certainly was made up of 12, 13 sovereign states. So to call it a fiction, it's a disingenuous argument, and you can tell.
And the argument of half the room is that's the reason why the Articles of Confederation weren't working, was because the states had sovereignty and too much sovereignty. And while that argument was correct to a point, that didn't mean that you, as a saying goes, throw the baby out with bathwater. The question was, how much centralization do you need? How much power do you give this new government while still trying to maintain the sovereignty of the states? And people like King are saying, well, you can't keep the sovereignty of states; they'll interfere.
Next to speak is Mr. Dayton of New Jersey. When assertion is given for proof and terror substituted for argument, he presumed they would have no effect, however eloquently spoken. Now that's a great dig on the King. It should have been.
And one of the reasons why Dayton's digging at is because King is basically saying that you're thinking it's not only wrong, it's foolish. I'm just right, and you're not. And Dayton's kind of taking it personal. That he's basically calling them stupid. All right, go ahead.
It should have been shewn that the evils we have experienced have proceeded from the equality now objected to, and that the seeds of dissolution for the state governments are not sown in the general government. He considered the system on the table as a novelty, an amphibious monster, and was persuaded that it never would be received by the people.
In other words, the states aren't going to ratify this. Understand that. No matter how much you think you might be right, the states will disagree with you. These, phantom states, you're not going to get it past them.
Luther Martin, one of our favorites, then says, I would never confederate if it could not be done on just principles. Okay. Mr. Madison would acquiesce in the concession hinted by Mr. Wilson on condition that a due independence should be given to the Senate. The plan in its present shape makes the Senate absolutely dependent on the states. The Senate, therefore, is only another edition of Congress. He knew the faults of that body and had used a bold language against it. Still, he would preserve the state rights as carefully as the trials by jury.
Now, real quick, I wanted to go back to Dayton just for a moment, only because I knew a little bit about him, only because he sticks out to me, because I know that he's the youngest guy to sign the Constitution after the convention. He is 26. Small state guy from New Jersey. And he actually opposed the 3/5 compromise, arguing that counting enslaved people to determine states' House representation boosted Southern political power. He was worried not only about the big states, but about the South.
Yeah, I probably need to talk a little bit more about the 3/5, because it actually was a balance. It was a compromise.
Mm-hmm.
If you're allowed to count your slaves as to get extra representatives in the House of Representatives, taxation at the time was also done by apportionment. Right. So you're also going to pay for that price at 3/5.
Mm-hmm.
So you couldn't just flood your state with a bunch. If you wanted to flood your state with a bunch of slaves, you're going to pay the price in terms of taxes to the rest of the country.
Right.
That's not completely dissimilar to what Franklin had just proposed about having tax revenue-based apportionment. So next to speak would be Mr. Bedford. And where do I have
Bedford's from Delaware.
And that is Gunning Bedford Jr. He contended that there was no middle way between a perfect consolidation and a mere confederacy of the states. The first is out of the question, and in the latter they must continue, if not perfectly, yet equally sovereign. If political societies possess ambition, avarice, and all the other passions which render them formidable to each other, ought we not to view them in this light here? Will not the same motives operate in America as elsewhere? If any gentleman doubts it, let him look at the votes. Have they not been dictated by interest, by ambition? And that's true. We've been going through a lot of these votes, and it's, you can almost predict it to be large state versus small state in a lot of these resolutions.
Yeah, and Bedford, as you probably picked up on just by listening to him, he's a fierce small state defender. Maybe even too much so that he didn't want the big states to have any toe through the doorway.
He says, are not the large states evidently seeking to aggrandize themselves at the expense of the small?
Hence what I said.
They think no doubt that they have the right on their side, but interest had blinded their eyes. Look at Georgia. Though a small state at present, she is actuated by the prospect of soon being a great one. South Carolina is actuated both by present interests and future prospects. She hopes, too, to see the other states cut down to her own dimensions. North Carolina has the same motives of present and future interests. Virginia follows. Maryland is not on that side of the question. Pennsylvania has a direct and future interest. Massachusetts has a decided and palpable interest in the part she takes. Can it be expected that the small states will act from pure disinterestedness?
Yeah, in other words, say that the larger states, they're looking to the future and what they're going to be able to get out of this. Well, you don't think the small states have that same concern? Is basically what he's saying.
Look at Great Britain. Is the representation there less unequal? But we shall be told again that that is the rotten part of the Constitution. Have not the boroughs, however, held fast their constitutional rights? And are we to act with greater purity than the rest of mankind? Talking about human nature here. There will be rivalries, there will be greed, there will be avarice. An exact proportion in the representation is not preserved in any one of the states. Will it be said that an inequality of power will not result from an inequality of votes? Given the opportunity and ambition, will not fail to abuse it. The whole history of mankind proves it.
What he's saying is, if you create the opportunity for ill actions, tyranny, whatever you want, then it's going to happen. It goes back to discussions I've had on other programs. Or I remember Dad used to tell me, boy, if you don't want to get in trouble, don't put yourself in that position in the first place. And that's basically what he's saying. If you provide the opportunity, tyranny will happen. So you got to do everything you can to guard against it. And he was, fiercely advocating that the way to guard against that is to make sure the states have a reasonable voice. He was once again, fierce advocate for states' rights. And by the way, he has an interesting connection to Hamilton we'll talk about in a minute, but go ahead.
The three large states have a common interest to bind them together in commerce. But whether a combination, as we suppose, or a competition, as others suppose, shall take place among them, in either case, the smaller states must be ruined. We must, like Solon, make such a government as the people will approve.
Solon was a Greek philosopher, and Solon was, the quote that he's most famous for is, without law, there is no freedom. So what he was saying is, you got to have government. It's necessarily evil, but you've got to have it in order to have freedom. You need to have a law. And Solon and Polybius were two of the minds that they drew from that Greek age. All right, go ahead.
Will the smaller states ever agree to the proposed degradation of them? It is not true that the people will not agree to enlarge the powers of the present Congress. The language of the people has been that Congress ought to have the power of collecting an impost and of coercing the states when it may be necessary. It's a pretty important sentence there. How much more power are we going to give them? This will be debated over the next few months, and that's where you get this will lead directly to the enumeration doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
On the first point, they have been explicit and in a manner unanimous in their declarations. And must they not agree to this and similar measures if they ever mean to discharge their engagements? The little states are willing to observe their engagements, but will meet the large ones on no ground but that of the Confederation. It's a bold statement. Look, we're willing to compromise some, but here's where we draw the line in the ground. We are going to remain a confederacy and a sovereign state. We have been told with a dictatorial air that this is the last moment for a fair trial in favor of good government. It will be the last indeed if the propositions reported from the committee go forth to the people. It was under no apprehensions. The large states dare not dissolve the Confederation. If they do, the small ones will find some foreign ally of more honor and good faith who will take them by the hand and do them justice. He did not mean by this to intimidate or alarm. It was a natural consequence which ought to be avoided by enlarging the federal powers, not annihilating the federal system. This is what the people expect. All agree in the necessity of a more efficient government, and why not make such a one as they desire?
Now, this is setting the stage for something. This whole convention was about fixing the Articles of Confederation. And he's basically arguing here, we can't dissolve it, that we got to fix it, we can't replace it. And but what's happening here is the stage is being set that they are going to decide we are dissolving it, we are writing a new constitution. And once that is discovered over the next week, there are delegates that will walk out and want nothing to do with this. Now, that said, Bedford remains for the entirety of the convention. He does eventually sign the Constitution, the final U.S. Constitution, but he does it almost begrudgingly. It's like, all right, fine, kind of give in. Now, one other thing is he had a connection to Hamilton. He and Alexander Hamilton had known each other for a very long time. They went to college together at what today is called Princeton College of New Jersey. But ideologically, they were exact opposites. If there was a guy that was the exact as far opposite as you could get to Hamilton in that room, Bedford was pretty close, if not the guy. And like I said, a fierce proponent for states' rights and preserving the autonomy of the states. So this is I enjoyed hearing what he had to say.
Yeah, that was a really good speech he just made there, and basically telling the big states, don't push the envelope because we'll just say, hey, France, cut us a deal.
And he said, hey, I'm not threatening. That's just what's going to happen naturally.
I wanted to share a different screen here. This is from a video we did about repealing the 17th Amendment when I showed the map of the size of the various states' population. Up top is the small states, 7 of them, making up about 1 million inhabitants. Down below are the 6 quote-unquote big states, with the largest being Virginia with 750,000. And were they representative by proportion, that gives the large states 84 votes to the small states 30, if it's population-based apportionment. If it's one seat, obviously, per state, it'd be 7-6 in favor of the small. That balance is so important. And that's what they're arguing over right here, are these actual numbers.
And now this goes back to Madison's Federalist 10 comment. Well, how do you stop bigger factions? You set them against each other. So when it comes to when it came to population, the big states were the bigger faction. When it came to equality in a Senate, like 2 per, then the agrarian or smaller states would be the bigger faction. Now you've got both of them having enough strength to debate each other from a position of power, a position of strength. And that's the way to handle a situation like what we had. You don't allow the minority to be crushed. You give the minority a strong enough voice that they can equally from equal footing argue their point, and maybe even a little bit stronger footing, considering that the Senate ultimately got the advice and consent powers and the power to ratify treaties, among other things.
Going back to Ellsworth, he says under a national government, he should participate in the national security, as remarked by Mr. King, but that was all. What he wanted was domestic happiness. Oh, the national government could not descend to the local objects on which this depended. It could only embrace objects of a general nature.
Now, this is actually a good thing that Ellsworth is saying, and you mentioned this a moment ago where it's going to start getting into the enumerated powers. He's basically saying, all right, fine, we'll have a national government, but they'll handle the national things, and we'll leave the local domestic stuff to the states. That's essentially what he's saying. Localism. It's actually a very Jeffersonian statement, which is kind of surprised coming from him. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I'm sure he's going to weigh in later on when they start talking about the necessary and proper clause or the general welfare, which was a slippery slope.
Right.
He turned his eyes, therefore, to the preservation of his rights to the state governments. From these alone, he could derive the greatest happiness he expects in his life. That's such an important sentence. This really comes down to the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. Every single state had their own bills of rights. Your state was going to preserve your God-given natural rights. That was not the federal government's job.
In other words, your rights is a local issue. Your rights are a local issue, and that's what was expected to be.
Yeah, and the people who demanded a Bill of Rights, who are most of the anti-federalists that are here, I think they erred in demanding a Bill of Rights, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
Where the big mistake is we should have put that in the Constitution. We should have enumerated the enumeration doctrine, which basically says the same thing as the 10th Amendment and encompasses the whole Bill of Rights, and made it very crystal clear that the powers we're given this federal government are enumerated and few. And anything beyond that goes with the states. And that's what he's saying here.
Once again, shockingly.
His happiness depends on their existence as much as a new-born infant on its mother for nourishment. If this reasoning was not satisfactory, he had nothing to add that could be so. Well, he got that one right, Doug.
No, well, a broken clock is right twice a day. So.
All right, Rufus King comes back with preserving the states in a subordinate degree.
All right, fine. We'll keep the states, but they're the peasants of government.
Yeah, here's Hamilton licking his incorporation chops. And as far as they could be necessary for the purposes stated by Mr. Ellsworth.
In other words, to handle local stuff.
He did not think a full answer had been given to those who have apprehended a dangerous encroachment on their jurisdictions. Expedients might be devised, as he conceived, that would give them all the security the nature of things would admit of. In the establishment of societies, the Constitution was to the legislature what the laws were to the individual.
Law of the land, and when it comes to the legislature, it's going to what's going to be what guides them.
As the fundamental rights of individuals are secured by express provisions in the state constitutions. Thank you very much.
That's so King stumbled on a truth there. Somehow.
Well, they all knew that
states are a local issue that belong to the states.
That shows you how universal that belief was in the founding generation. Incorporation was never a thing.
Right.
It was summoned out of thin air by 20th century progressive judges.
And as I was indicating the other day on yesterday on Curry Meyer's program, I was on KMET on a host there as a guest. This idea that the states would be willing to even give up that, it would have never flown. This idea of an incorporation of the rights to the states, incorporation of the powers where the federal government could become basically the enforcers of your rights and guarantors of your rights over the states was a completely foreign idea. The founding fathers, the whole point of this whole exercise in the end was to secure our rights. That's the whole point. A good government secures your rights.
Why may not a like security be provided for the rights of states in the National Convention? The Articles of Union between England and Scotland furnish an example of such a provision in favor of sundry rights of Scotland. When that union was in agitation, the same language of apprehension, which has been heard from the smaller states, was in the mouths of the Scotch patriots. The Articles, however, had not been violated, and the Scotch have found an increase of prosperity and happiness. He was aware that this will be called a mere paper security. He thought it a sufficient answer to say that if fundamental articles of compact, there's that magic word, are no sufficient defense against physical power, neither will there be any safety against it if there were no compact.
Interesting comparison to Scotland.
He could not sit down without taking some notice of this language of the honorable gentleman from Delaware, Mr. Bedford. It was not he that had uttered a dictatorial language. This intemperance.
Hang on. I wonder if he said that he's throwing his hands. Hey, it wasn't me. I'm not the one calling for the big states to be dictators of the small states.
This intemperance had marked the honorable gentleman himself. It was not he who was with a vehemence unprecedented in that house, had declared himself ready to turn his hopes from our common country and court the protection of some foreign hand. This too was the language of the honorable member himself. He was grieved that such a thought had entered into his heart. He was more grieved that such an expression had dropped from his lips. The gentleman could only excuse it to himself on the score of passion. For himself, whatever might be the distress, he would never court relief from a foreign power. How dare you even suggest disloyalty to this great union?
As he speaks from the other side of his mouth. Mr. King, I have to admit, he's pretty talented at speaking out both sides of his mouth.
All right, we're going to break there for this week, since the week's actually over. We'll be picking up again on Monday, July 2nd. So they're going to have Sunday off. They'll be talking Monday. Then they're going to take off July 3rd and 4th for some silly reason. And pick back up again July 5th. So we should probably get through most of this week when we meet next week.
July 5th, 6th, and 7th. This is where John Lancey and Robert Yates starts becoming an important part of what's going on. Or should I say an important not part anymore? We'll see.
I think I'm going to walk over the next weekend and take another tour of the Lansing Governor Lansing's mansion. See if I can pick up some more historical factoids for that, since it's right next door, 3 houses down. Well, pretty good episode, Doug. They are, what do we tell them today? What do we talk about?
Well, it's interesting because you were right. We started to see in the beginnings of the enumeration doctrine, the beginnings of this idea that we've got to have these two chambers. We saw not only the battle between the big states and small states, but the North and the South, and other battles start to come to the surface. I think we're at a point in the convention where the folks that are slowly beginning to become a little more anti-federalist or a little more reasonable, depending on which group you're talking about, are starting to take shape in a more visible manner. And you can see a break in the Hamiltonians, where some of them are standing fiercely on their Hamiltonian ideas, while others are starting to waffle all over the place. And in the case of King, claim that he's being wronged in the way he's being talked about.
We've got people debating whether the states should even exist at all.
Yeah.
And That's the pure Hamiltonian. And you got the other ones that said states must maintain enough sovereignty, and if you try to take away too much of their power, it's never going to be ratified, and we're going to be scattered, and the danger of the risk of European powers again. And that's all factually true.
We're starting to see more talk about the Confederation and whether or not the Confederation can survive, or must it survive? Must it remain in place? Must it not? And we're going to see more of that in the next few days.
And that's just going to hammer home, what we've been saying for years. We are not a national government. We never have been. Lincoln may have tried to make us one at the point of a bayonet, but that is not what our written governing documents say.
Right.
And these founding fathers are making it really clear that this thing we're setting up, it is going to remain a federation. And there's a huge difference. So, we follow.
How do you keep the state sovereign yet have a central government? Where is that balance? This is what they're searching for.
And this comes down to natural law.
Mm-hmm.
Life, liberty, and property. If you own yourself, you have the rights to your own life, your own liberty, your own property. Nobody can take them away for it. The problem is human nature. And that's why human beings form governments, to secure those rights from foreign influence. That is the only purpose of a foreign government. I mean, that is the only, of a central government. That is its only ethical and moral job. Anytime it starts incrementing on such and such by taxing anything, taxation is theft. Anytime it starts saying, oh, we'll build some, federally funded internal improvements. You can't do that without taking some of my property. You are now taking the first step towards socialism. So I call Alexander Hamilton the first socialist in America. And that's how we got where we are today, where we've got a $38 trillion debt that can never be repaid. Federal government takes up some over 50% of all GDP is government spending. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. None of these things are, enumerated powers of the federal government. And that's the problem. And that's why we're doing these shows to hammer this point home. So maybe we can have a national conversation and get back to being a federal republic, which is why I named this show the Re-Federalist Report. Because I want make federalism great again. Doug, where can the people find you?
DouglasVGibbs.com, DouglasVGibbs.com. I write just about every day, pretty much every day. You can also go to the radio and video pages to see my shows. I got to update my radio page. It still says I'm on KMET. And thank you for all of your interest in my new book, The Constitutional Presidency of Donald J. Trump. Oh, you didn't know about that book? Amazon, go there and get it. Constitutional Presidency of Donald J. Trump by Douglas V. Gibbs. That's my latest and greatest.
I am starting to push my YouTube channel because it started to grow organically. I'm picking up a lot of followers there. So if you don't have access to Rumble, you can also find me on YouTube, and just go War Hamster, one word, with the numbers 2560. Subscribe to me on YouTube. That way you can find me whether you got access to Rumble or not. YouTube's got it obviously easier, bigger following and stuff like that. So I'm now starting to promote the YouTube channel. Yeah. Hopefully we stay on topic so don't get me any more strikes, but you never know.
Yeah, I'm on both YouTube and Rumble. YouTube, I have more subscribers, but less listens. On Rumble, I have a smaller subscribership, but yet those listeners are more loyal and constantly listening. I get a lot more views. So it's fascinating between the two. But yeah, I'm on Rumble and YouTube as well. Douglas V. Gibbs. Douglas V. Gibbs is my key, even on my social media. X, Truth Social, Facebook, LinkedIn, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Very good. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you making the time today. This is always a pleasure. This is one of my favorite episodes, actually. I thought we had a bunch of really good opinions that hit on some great topics. I know there's going to be follow-up on it, but we're getting into the meat and bones. Really nitty-gritty stuff is coming.
Yeah, and we got a chance to get to know a few of the guys, a couple of the participants a little bit more too, and I think that is important because, folks, it's not just about what they said and why they said it, but where they were coming from. Remember, as was indicated in one of the discussions, the climate of the states. What was the climate? And we're talking political climate as well, not just physical climate. I joke about the physical climate. Of course, the Vikings were fierce. They lived in a fierce climate. And so that is important, but there's also a political climate, there's an economic climate, there's all kinds of climates to discuss here, and all of them are converging during this convention. And I think you're going to see over the next week or two the explosion over whether or not we should even consider keeping the Articles of Confederation. And many of these delegates are realizing it's not a matter of keeping it or discarding it, but keeping some of it in this new system.
Very good. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. Till then, cheers.